Let's take a look at the geographic distribution of the dry forest BEC zones in BC. So here we're looking at the southern portion of the province. You can see I've overlaid a semi-transparent layer of the BEC zones here. So the yellow is interior Douglas fir. You can see it takes up a large area of the southern interior on low to middle elevations. It creeps a little bit into valleys on the leeward side of the Coast Mountains, and then there's a strip of it in the southern Rocky Mountain Trench here, in between the Columbia Mountains and the Rocky Mountains. Ponderosa pine is in brown here, so there isn't a lot of it in total area. It's in valleys at lower elevation. There's a fair amount of it here in the Okanagan Valley, and then also along the Fraser and Thompson and Nicola rivers. And then red is the bunchgrass zone, so this is also low elevation in valleys, but in hotter and drier locations. So it's along the Fraser Valley and the Thompson River, and also in the valley between Kamloops and Merritt. Let's look a little bit closer at this, a subset of this map. We'll zoom into that rectangle there. Here we're looking at the Fraser River Valley from Lillooet up here down to Lytton. We're also looking at the Thompson River, so coming in from Cache Creek and Ashcroft down through Spence's Bridges and then into Lytton, where it merges with the Fraser River. Let's start by zooming into Spence's Bridge, and we'll follow this valley to Cache Creek. I'm just showing the regular satellite imagery here, but if you look, you should be able to see variation in the vegetation. At lower elevations, we're looking mostly at grassland. It's a dry grassland in these images. It's during the dry part of the year, so it's brown. And as you move up the walls of the canyon of the valley, you start to see some sparse forest, and then at higher elevations, more continuous forest. In this area here, here's Ashcroft. We're mostly looking at grasslands here as we come up. There's Cache Creek in the corner of this image. Now let's overlay our three BEC zones that we're considering here. So again, the red is bunchgrass, the brown is ponderosa pine, and the yellow is interior Douglas fir. Let's zoom back into Spence's Bridge and follow this valley back up the Thompson River as we head toward Ashcroft. So you see at the highest elevations, we have that yellow, we have the interior Douglas fir. As we move down, you'll see a more brown. I know it's a little bit hard to see over the vegetation, but this is the ponderosa pine BEC zone. And then at the lower elevation, right along the river, we are in the bunchgrass zone. Now let's take a look at the Fraser River Valley from Lytton upstream to Lillooet. And again, we're starting with just the regular satellite imagery without any overlay. So here we are starting just south of Lytton, where the Thompson River comes in to the Fraser, and moving roughly northward. It's a little bit more mountainous in this area than the last valley that we were looking at. And again, as you look around, you'll see some very sparsely vegetated areas, some lightly forested areas with sparse or open forests, and denser forests. And as you go up the valley, note the difference in aspect, like right here, for example, between the two sides of the river. You see pretty substantial differences in vegetation, even if you're at the same elevation. And here we are coming into Lillooet. Let's follow the same path, but start with our BEC overlay on there. So note we don't have bunchgrass in this area as we zoom in to a view of Lytton. So we're transitioning from ponderosa pine at the lower elevations in the valley to interior Douglas fir forests as we move up the slopes of the valley here. And again, pay a little attention to aspect. You notice, like on the left there, you see some sharp differences between the ponderosa pine zone and the interior Douglas fir zone based on aspect. Also note between the two sides of the valley, there's a little bit of asymmetry in the elevation where ponderosa pine transitions to interior Douglas fir. And here we are arriving in Lillooet again. Let's explore this relationship with aspect a little bit more. I'm zooming in on the Fraser River Valley in a location a bit south of Lillooet. Note the really extreme difference in vegetation on both sides of the river there. And for some context, the right side of the river has a southwest aspect, and the left side of the river has a northeast aspect. That location A, it's at 425 meters elevation, and this is a spot where I actually have taken students a few times for a field course that I teach. It's an open ponderosa pine forest. This is an actual photo of this site, so quite open, certainly not light limited, and a lot of those trees are about 10 meters or so in height, so not especially tall, especially compared to the coast. And if we look across the river to the northeast aspect, we see a really pronounced difference in the vegetation there. So Site B is a site that is at the exact same elevation, 425 meters, so we can make a direct comparison that the only thing that's varying between these sites is the aspect. Other things should be relatively equal. So let's zoom in here a little bit. And we probably can't tell the species from here, but I presume those are mostly Douglas fir, and you can see the forest is quite dense with a closed canopy. And if we lay our BEC zones over that, we see that that's in the interior Douglas fir zone. And our site on the other side of the river is in the ponderosa pine zone. The difference between sites A and B comes down to aspect. Site A has a southwest aspect, so it receives much more insolation, and Site B has a northeast aspect, so it receives less insolation. And because of that, we get higher evapotranspiration at Site A and lower evapotranspiration at Site B. From those photos, you could probably tell that Site A is really a moisture or water-limited forest. If there was more water available there, we would be closer to a closed canopy forest instead of being a very sparse open canopy forest. So that difference in aspect is pushing us much further in the dry direction at Site A, and that's reflected in the vegetation we see. If we move up the valley a little bit and lower our perspective, so we're kind of looking straight down this valley, we can see an interesting pattern related to aspect and elevation of the boundaries between these two BEC zones. On the left side, we have a northeast aspect with lower evapotranspiration, and on the right side, we have a southwest aspect with higher evapotranspiration. So we see the boundary between interior Douglas fir and ponderosa pine on the left side of the valley is almost at the water level, whereas on the right side, it's probably 100 or 200 meters, maybe even a little bit more, higher than that. That reflects that on the drier aspect, we have to go higher in elevation to reach lower temperatures before we reach a climate that is comparable to a climate at lower elevations on the wetter aspect. So this relationship between aspect and the elevation of transitions between different BEC zones is something that we see quite a bit in different mountainous areas in BC. And keep that in mind because often we think a lot about transitions based on elevation, but just know that the aspect is going to influence which elevation that transition happens at.